In the summer of 1887, in the dry country east of the Bighorn foothills in Wyoming Territory, a young woman knelt at the mouth of a creek that no longer held water and pressed her palm flat against the cracked clay, the way a person listens for a heartbeat they are afraid has already stopped. She was 19 years old. She had $2.40 knotted in the corner of a flour sack, a tin cup, a folding knife with a bone handle that had belonged to a dead man, and a pair of boots that had walked her 11 miles from a house that no longer wanted her. The creek bed ran away from her toward the north, a pale ribbon of dust and water-smoothed stone winding between low hills furred with sage, and she had been told by the only voice she still trusted that water always remembers where it has been. She did not yet know what waited at the end of that creek. She only knew she had nowhere else to walk. Her name was Della Hartwick, and she had been put out of her uncle's house at first light with the door latched behind her before she reached the gate. This is a story about a girl everyone had decided was worth nothing, and about a thing the country had thrown away and forgotten, and about how the two of them, the discarded girl and the discarded thing, found each other at the end of a dead creek and proved the whole valley wrong. If you have ever been counted out by people who never once asked what you could do, stay near. You will want to see how this one turns. Della had come to the Hartwick place 4 years before, an orphan of 12-handed, across a county line like a debt being settled. Her mother had died of the lung fever in a railroad town to the south, and there had been no one but a half-brother of her father's, a man named Royce Hartwick, who ran cattle on leased grass and resented every mouth he had not chosen to feed. He had taken her because the churchwomen shamed him into it, and because a girl could be made to work. For 4 years she had worked. She had hauled water from the seep a quarter-mile from the house, 2 buckets on a yoke across her shoulders before the sun was up, and again after it went down. She had rendered tallow in a great black kettle until her eyes streamed, and her hair carried the smell of it for days. She had mended fence wire with hands that learned to bleed without complaint, and patched the men's shirts, and gutted the hogs at killing time, and stood at the cold edge of every supper, while Royce and his hands ate first, and she ate what was left. The 2 daughters of the house, younger than she and softer, were given schooling and Sunday dresses, and Della was given the work, and she did not complain because complaint was a coin that bought nothing in that house. She kept her eyes open instead, because keeping her eyes open was the one thing no one could take from her. What Royce Hartwick did not know, because he had never thought to ask, was that the old man who lived in the line shack at the far edge of his grass had been teaching her since the first winter. His name was Amos Creel, and he had been a well witch and a digger, and a finder of water across 3 territories, before his knees gave out and his eyes clouded, and the only work left to him was watching another man's fence. The hands at the ranch called him the dowser and laughed at him behind their teeth, an old fool with a forked stick, but Royce kept him on because Amos could still find a seep where no one else could, and on leased dry grass a man who could find water was cheaper than digging wells that came up empty. Della had brought Amos his supper across the sage every evening of those 4 years, and somewhere in the second winter the old man had begun to talk, and somewhere after that he had begun to teach. He taught her that water in that country did not run where the map said it ran. He taught her that a creek could go dry on the surface and still hold a thread of itself underground, traveling the old channel patient as grief. He taught her to read the set of the gravel and the lean of the willows and the particular green of the grass that grew over buried damp. He would take the forked stick of green willow that the hands laughed at and put it in her small hands and close her fingers over it and tell her the stick was nothing. The stick was a toy. The stick only gave her hands something to do while her eyes did the real work. Look at the cottonwoods, he would say. A cottonwood does not grow where it is dry. Look at where the deer paw in the dusk. Look at the frost, how it lies thick in one hollow and thin in the next. The water tells you where it is if you are humble enough to stop telling it where it ought to be. He taught her the names of the rock layers, and how a spring would seal itself behind a fall of stone and wait, sometimes for years, for something to break the seal and let it out again. He showed her, with a tin cup and a slope of sand behind the line shack, how a little dam could turn a whole flow aside and leave the old bed bone dry, while the water ran fat and secret somewhere you would never think to look. And he taught her, the last winter, with his breath coming hard and his clouded eyes fixed on the low ceiling of the shack, that the worst drought the valley had ever known had not been an act of God at all, though the men who profited from it had been glad to call it one. Amos Creel died in the spring of 1887, 3 weeks before Della was put out of the house. He left her the bone-handled knife, the folding rule he measured falls of rock with, and a single sentence she would carry the rest of her life. "Find where the water went," he had said, his voice no more than a dry rustle. "They stopped it on purpose, and the proof is still down there in the dark." She had not understood him then. She understood him now, walking the dead creek with the sun climbing white and merciless over the hills, because she had spent 4 years watching the Hartwick grass go to dust, while the big outfit to the north, the Varon Land and Cattle Company, grew fat on water no one else could reach. The valley had not always been dry. The old-timer spoke of a time 15 years gone when Sweetwater Creek ran clear and steady the whole length of the basin, and a dozen small outfits had watered their stock along it and made a living. Then the story went. The dry years came. The creek failed at its head. The small outfits withered one by one, sold their leases for pennies to the Varon Company, and drifted away or died. And the Varon Company, which had bought a played-out valley for almost nothing, somehow still had water. Deep wells that never ran low, green meadows in the worst Augusts, while everyone around them parched. Men called it luck. Men called it the company's deep pockets and modern engineering. Amos Creel had called it something else. Della reached the place where the creek bent hard against a shoulder of red rock by the middle of the afternoon, and there she found the first thing that was wrong. The channel above the bend was scoured smooth, the way running water leaves stone, every pebble polished and set in its place by years of current. The channel below the bend was different. The gravel lay loose and unsorted, tumbled, the way gravel lies when it has been dumped by hands rather than laid down by water. She crouched and ran her fingers through it and felt the difference Amos had taught her to feel, turning a stone over in her palm and finding its underside as sharp and unworn as the day it broke from the cliff, a stone that no current had ever rolled. Above the bend, the creek had once run for a very long time. Below the bend, the creek had stopped running suddenly, all at once, the way a creek stops only when something is put across it. She walked the line where the two kinds of gravel met back and forth 3 times, and each time the truth of it sat heavier on her, because the meeting of the two was a straight line, and water does not draw straight lines. She stood and looked at the shoulder of red rock and understood that she was looking at a wall. It did not look like a wall. It looked like a natural fall of stone, a slope of broken rock against the cliff face, the kind of slide that happens in that country after a wet spring. Della, though, had spent 4 years learning to see what the land was actually doing under what it pretended to do, and the more she looked, the less the slide looked like an accident. The stones were too even in their size. The base of the slope was too straight and low against the cliff, half buried under the rubble. She could see the squared end of a timber, old and gray and split, a piece of cut and dressed wood that no flood had ever placed there. Someone had built something at this bend 15 years before, and then someone had pulled the rock down over it to hide what they had built. She made her camp that night in the lee of the red rock with no fire, because she had nothing to cook, and the country was too dry to risk a spark, and she lay awake under a sky thick with stars and listened. The reason she had walked out of the Hartwick house and onto this dead creek instead of into the nearest town to beg work was the same reason she had survived 4 years of being treated as a thing rather than a girl. Royce had put her out over a broken churn and a temper that had been looking for a reason, and as the door latched, she had understood, with no anger left in her at all, that she was free now, free in the only way a person with nothing is free, and that the one inheritance she had was a dead man's certainty about where the water went. So she had not gone to town, she had gone to the creek. It is a thing few people know that buried water makes a sound, a faint and almost nothing sound, the breath of a current moving through stone far below. Amos had made her press her ear to the cold ground 100 times until she could hear it, until she could tell running water from the wind in the grass and the blood in her own ears. She pressed her ear to the ground now against the loose gravel below the bend, and for a long while she heard nothing at all, only the great silence of the high country. And then, very faint, so faint, she held her breath to be sure of it. She heard it. Water. Moving. Somewhere down in the dark beneath the rock, the creek, she had been told, was still alive, still running, sealed off and forced down into a channel no one could see. She did not sleep after that. She lay with her hand on the bone-handled knife and watched the stars wheel and felt the old man's sentence settle into her like a stone into still water. They stopped it on purpose, and the proof is still down there in the dark. In the gray before dawn, she began to dig. She had no shovel. She had her hands, the folding knife, a flat stone she shaped into a scraper, and the lessons of a dead man. She did not dig at random. She read the slope the way Amos had taught her, found the line where the dumped rock met the older stone, and worked along the buried timber, clearing the rubble away from it handful by handful, hour by hour, the sun climbing and the sweat drying to salt on her arms before it could fall. By noon she had uncovered 3 feet of the timber and found that it was not one timber, but the corner of a frame, mortised and pegged, the work of a careful builder. By dusk she had cleared the whole of one upright and the top of a second, and she had begun to understand the shape of the thing. It was a headgate. A wooden sluice and gate of the kind, built to control the flow of an irrigation ditch, to open a channel or close it at a man's will. Someone had built a headgate across Sweetwater Creek at the one narrow place where the whole flow could be caught. And then, when it had done its work, someone had buried it. For 3 days she dug. She dug until her fingernails split, and she bound her fingers in strips torn from the hem of her dress. She fell into a rhythm with the work the way Amos had told her all real labor, had a rhythm a body could lean on, and she learned the slope by feel, where the dumped rock lay loose and could be lifted away, and where the older stone held fast and was not to be wasted on. She found the willow lever did the work of 10 of her fingers and saved her hands for the close work, the clearing of the joints and pegs. She drank from a seep she opened low in the bank with the flat scraper. Brown water she let settle in the tin cup until it ran clear enough, because Amos had taught her that a person who could find water need never go thirsty even in a drought. She dug until the $2.40 meant nothing because there was nothing to spend it on, and the hunger became a dull and distant thing she set aside the way she had learned to set aside every other pain. On the second day, a rattlesnake came out of the warm rock, and she went still and let it pass, because the country was full of things that would hurt you if you moved without thinking, and full of things that would not if you did. She dug because the dead creek had begun to give up its secret, and she could no more have stopped than she could have stopped her own heart. On the morning of the 4th day she cleared the last of the rubble from the base of the gate and found the mechanism, the great iron screw, and the cast wheel that raised and lowered the wooden leaf, rusted but whole, and she found that the gate stood closed. Shut hard, driven down and pinned, and then the rock pulled over it, so that the creek, which should have run free down the basin, had been forced instead into a side channel cut deep into the rock, a channel that ran north toward the Varon meadows. She sat back on her heels in the bright morning with the iron wheel under her bleeding hands, and saw the whole of it at last. The drought had been no act of God. 15 years before, when the small outfits still watered their stock along Sweetwater Creek, someone had built this gate in secret, closed it, and stolen the entire flow of the basin, diverting it underground into a channel that fed the Varon land alone. The creek had failed. The small outfits had died. The Varon Company had bought a dying valley for pennies and then enjoyed, year after year, the water it had hidden from everyone else. It was theft. Theft of a whole valley, dressed up as weather, and the proof of it was the gate under her hands. She thought of all the men who had laughed at Amos Creel and his forked stick. She thought of her uncle's grass going to dust while he cursed his luck and never once looked north. She thought with a cold clarity that surprised her that there was no one in the valley who would take the word of a 19-year-old girl thrown out of her uncle's house. The gate was the proof. And a gate buried in a creek bed proved nothing to a court. She knew, and she had no court. And the Varon Company had lawyers and money and 15 years of a story everyone already believed. What she had was the water itself. And she knew, because Amos had taught her, that a thing built by hands could be unbuilt by hands. She studied the gate for the better part of that day. The wooden leaf had swollen and seized in its frame, but the iron screw was sound and the cast wheel would still turn if she could free it. She cleared the channel below the gate so the water would have somewhere to go, lifting stone after stone until her back was a single ache. She found a length of the buried timber she could use as a lever, and she scoured the rusted threads of the screw with sand and the flat of her knife, working grit into the seized iron the way Amos had shown her. A man works a stuck thing loose with patience instead of force. And in the long gold light of the evening, she set her hands to the wheel and put her whole weight against it, and it did not move. She braced the lever and threw herself against it again and again, and the rust screamed and held, and her bound hands slipped and bled, and once she fell hard against the stone and lay a moment with the breath knocked out of her, looking up at the first stars. She got up, she set the lever again. The sun went down, and still the gate held shut. 15 years of rust and the weight of a buried river standing against the strength of one girl. And any sensible person would have called it impossible and walked away. She did not weep. She sat in the dark and ate the last of nothing and pressed her ear once more to the ground and listened to the water that wanted out. And in the morning she went at it again. It was on that 5th day that the old man found her. She heard the horse before she saw it, the slow clop of a tired animal on the dry creek stones, and she came up with the bone-handled knife open in her fist, because a girl alone in that country learned to come up ready. The man who rode around the shoulder of Red Rock, though, was old. Older than Amos had been, with a white beard stained yellow at the corners and a face like a dropped saddle. And he sat his horse looking down at the uncovered gate with an expression she could not read. His name was Thaddeus Bell, and he had run 40 head along Sweetwater Creek in the years before it failed, and he had sold his lease to the Varon Company for $60 and the price of a wagon out, and he had spent 15 years in a sod house at the dry edge of the basin, believing like everyone else that God had taken his water. He got down off the horse slowly, the way old men do, and he walked to the gate and put his hand on the gray timber, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I helped build a ditch like this once," he said. "For wages, a company man hired a crew of us. Strangers paid us cash, kept us drunk, and we none of us knew what we were building or where." He looked at the closed gate and the channel running north. "They told us it was a ditch to bring water down to the homesteads," he said. "We thought we were doing a Christian thing." He looked at her, then at her split fingers and her ruined dress and her 19 years, and something in the old man's face came apart and put itself back together harder. "What do you mean to do?" he asked. "Open it," she said. Thaddeus Bell looked at the seized wheel and the swollen leaf and the 15 years of rust, and then he tied his horse and took off his coat. "I am old," he said, "but I am not dead, and I have wanted to put my hands on the man that did this for 15 years and never had a neck to reach for." He spat on his palms. "This will do." They worked the rest of that day together, the girl and the old man, and it was harder than one person could have done, and barely possible for two. They cleared and levered and oiled the screw with tallow from a candle stub out of Belle's saddlebag. Belle talked while they worked, the way men do who have been alone too long, and what he told her filled in the corners of the thing she had already half seen. He told her the name of the foreman who had hired the crew, a soft-handed man who paid in gold and never gave a straight answer. He told her how the work had gone on at night, lanterns hooded, the crew warned off asking questions, and how the foreman had stood over the closing of the gate himself and sent the men home the next morning with a bonus and a warning to keep their mouths shut. He had taken the bonus, Belle said, his voice gone bitter as alkali. He had taken it and bought the wagon that carried him off his own ruined grass, and he had not understood until this very day, with the uncovered gate under his hand, that the wagon had been bought with the price of his own undoing. They drove wedges to break the swollen leaf free of its frame, the old man swinging the rock maul he carried on his saddle, and the girl setting each wedge true. And in the last light of that 5th day, with both of them throwing their weight against the cast wheel and the rust shrieking and giving, the great wooden gate moved, an inch, then a hand's width. Then, with a groan that came up out of the rock like something waking, the leaf lifted, and the water that had been held in the dark for 15 years found the gap and came through. It came slowly at first, a dark seep around the base of the gate, and then it found its strength and rose, and then with a sound like a long indrawn breath, the whole sealed flow of Sweetwater Creek burst free of the channel that had stolen it and ran down its old bed for the first time in 15 years. Cold water, mountain water, sweet as anything Della had ever tasted, surging down the pale dead channel and turning the dust to mud and the mud to a running stream, racing away to the south through the parched basin toward the valley that had given up on it. It went faster than a person could walk, then faster than a horse could trot, a bright cold tongue of water unrolling down a bed that had been bone dry since before Della had learned to read, finding every dip and hollow it remembered, filling them, moving on. Della Hartwick stood in the rising water to her ankles and did not say a word. Beside her, the old man was weeping openly, his face turned up to the dark, and the only sound was the water, and the water was enough. Moving the gate, though, was not the same as proving the wrong, and Della knew it. A free-running creek would water the valley again, and that alone would change every life along it. The Varon meadows, cut off from their stolen flow, would brown and fail within a season, and men would notice and questions would be asked. The company, though, would have its story ready. A landslide had shifted, they would say. The creek had found a new course, an act of nature, just as its failure had been. They would not be caught by water alone. She needed the thing that turned a flood into evidence. She needed what Amos had meant when he said the proof is still down there in the dark. It was Belle who found it the next morning, in the silt the lowering water left behind in the old diversion channel. Where the stolen flow had run north for 15 years, it had carried silt and laid it down, and as the channel drained, the silt gave up what it had buried, a strongbox. Iron, riveted, the size of a saddle pannier, sealed against the water by its maker and by the very silt that had entombed it. It had been set into the wall of the diversion channel deliberately, in a niche cut for it, where the men who built the gate could reach it and no one else would ever look. Della had seen such a thing only once in a freight office in the railroad town. Where her mother died, she knew it was a company box. She knew that men who did their crimes carefully wrote them down, because a crime that is never written down cannot be enforced among thieves. It took them most of the day to free the box and break its seized lock with the iron lever, and when the lid came up, the smell of 15 years of sealed air came out, cold and strange, the breath of a thing that had been closed since before Della could read. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff as board, were the papers. There were the survey maps of the diversion, drawn fine and exact, signed by an engineer whose name meant nothing to Della and everything, it turned out, to a court. She unrolled them on the dry channel stones and weighted the corners with pebbles, and even she, who could not read a survey, could read what the lines plainly showed. The old creek crossed out and a new channel inked and running north, and a note in the margin in a clerk's careful hand giving the date the gate was to close. There were the wage ledgers, the crew of strangers paid in cash to build a ditch they were told was charity. Thaddeus Bell's own mark among them, where he had signed for 60 cents a day. The old man found his own name and went very quiet and touched it with one finger. As a man touches the headstone of someone he failed, there were the letters. Maud. Letters between the manager of the Varon Land and Cattle Company and a man in Cheyenne who held the company's purse. Letters that spoke plainly, in the dry, confident hand of men who never expected to be read, of the plan to seal the creek, ruin the smallholders, buy their leases at the bottom, and call it weather. One letter set down, in a column like a merchant's accounts, the names of the families to be broken, and beside each the price the company expected to pay for the lease once the water failed, and the sums were small. The sums were the price of a wagon and a road out, and Bell's name was on that list too, at $60. And the figure had been crossed through and marked paid. One letter, dated the spring before the creek failed, said that the beauty of the scheme was that drought required no defending, for no man sues the sky. Della Hartwick, 19 years old, sat in the drained channel with the letters in her bound and bleeding hands and held in her lap the proof that a whole valley had been robbed, and that the men who robbed it had been so sure of their safety that they had written down every step and locked it in iron and trusted the dark to keep it. She did not shout. She did not run for the town. She folded the oiled canvas back over the papers with great care, and she looked at the water running free down the old creek bed, and she thought of the old man in the line shack who had pressed her ear to the ground and made her listen for what the powerful had buried. Have you ever known a truth that someone with everything to lose had worked very hard to bury and wondered whether it would ever come to light? Hold on to that thought. This one came to light. What followed took longer than the digging and was, in its way, harder, because the law in that country moved slow and the Varon Company moved fast once it understood what had been found. Della Hartwick, though, had learned patience from a dead dowser, and she did not make the mistakes the company expected a thrown-out girl to make. She did not carry the papers into town and wave them about. She made Thaddeus Bell ride, instead, to the 3 families left in the basin who remembered the creek running, the ones who had not sold but had simply hung on, dying slow. And she put the survey maps and the letters into the hands of a circuit lawyer in the county seat, who had no love for the Varon Company and a long memory of the men it had broken. The water did the rest before the law ever caught up. Within a month, the Varon meadows browned and the company's cattle bawled at dry troughs, and the men of the basin, watering their stock along a creek that had been dead since their childhood, began to talk. The talk found the lawyer. The lawyer had the box. And the box had the letters, and the letters had names, and the names belonged to men who were still alive and still rich, and had for 15 years accepted the valley's gratitude for the wells they claimed to have dug at their own expense. The manager of the Varon Land and Cattle Company was a man named Crane, who had built his whole standing in the territory on being the clever man who kept water in a dry country, and when the contents of the iron box were read into the record of a territorial court the following autumn, his standing did not so much fall as simply cease to exist. The way a shadow ceases when the thing that cast it is taken away. He did not stand and rage. He did not flee in the night. He sat very still at the long table while the engineer's own survey was unrolled before him, and then he gathered his hat and walked out, and within the year the company was broken up and its leases scattered, and the water it had stolen ran free, and the man who had been so proud of his cleverness was not spoken of again except as a warning. He was never met in any reckoning grander than that. The papers did what no accusation could have done. They simply told the truth in his own hand and let it stand. The leases that the Varon Company had bought for pennies were unwound by the court, and where the original holders could be found, living or in their children, the land came back to them. Thaddeus Bell got his 40 acres along the creek, returned to him at the age of 71, and he stood on it with the water running past and said it was more than he had ever thought to see again. He built a new house with his own hands at the edge of the running water, slow, a board a week, and he lived in it 4 years before he died, and in those 4 years he was the one who told the story, over and over, to anyone who would sit still, of the girl who had dug for 4 days with her hands while he rode the basin believing the sky had robbed him. The 3 families who had hung on were made whole. A widow, named Esther Pruitt, who had buried a husband and 2 children, waiting for rain that never fell because it had been stolen before it could reach her, was given back the quarter section she had clung to through 15 dry years, and the creek now ran across the foot of it, and she planted the first orchard the basin had seen in a generation. And the small fortune the company had built on stolen water was broken apart and parceled back across the basin it had been taken from, debts settled one by one, a wrong made right, not by vengeance but by restitution, the patient undoing of a theft. Della Hartwick asked for none of it for herself, and this surprised the lawyer who had seen what greed did to people handed a windfall. She asked only for one thing. The line shack at the dry edge of the Hartwick grass, and the few acres around it where an old man had lived watching another man's fence and had taught a thrown-out girl to hear water in the dark, the court found a way to grant it. Royce Hartwick, whose leased grass turned green again that next spring when the creek came back, never spoke to her of what she had done, and she never asked him to. He had counted her as nothing once. The creek running past his fence said otherwise every day for the rest of his life, and that was enough. She had no need to say it aloud. She was not made rich. She did not want to be. She wanted what she got, which was a roof of her own and ground of her own, and water that came when she called it, because she had learned where it went and how to bring it back. In the years that followed, Della Creel, for she took the old man's name as her own when there was no one left to forbid it, became the person the basin sent for when a well came up dry or a spring failed or a creek went strange. She was not a dowser of the laughed-at kind. She read the rock and the gravel and the lean of the willows, the way Amos had taught her, and she found water where the experts with their instruments could not, and she never once charged a family that could not pay. She married no one, and answered to no one, and the men who had laughed at the old man with a forked stick grew old themselves, and sent their sons to fetch her when their wells failed, and the sons did not laugh. She put in wells along the whole length of the basin, and where a homestead had failed for want of water, she would walk the ground slow with her head tilted, listening, and more often than not, she would stop and set her heel down and say, "Dig here," and they would dig, and the water would come. There are people in that part of Wyoming today descended from the ones she helped, who will tell you that the Creel woman could hear water moving through solid stone, and that she learned it from an old man everyone else thought was a fool. She kept the bone-handled knife on a peg by her door her whole life, and the folding rule beside it, and on the day she could no longer climb the ridge to listen to the springs, she gave them to a girl she had been teaching, a thin, watchful child no one else had time for, and told her the one thing that mattered, the thing a dying man had once told her in a line shack at the edge of someone else's grass. Find where the water went. They stop it on purpose sometimes, and the proof is always down there in the dark, waiting for somebody patient enough to listen. The creek still runs. It runs past the foundations of the line shack, past the place where a 19-year-old girl once dug for 4 days with her hands because a dead man told her water remembers where it has been. In the late afternoon, when the light goes gold along the basin, the water catches it and carries it south, the way it did before the theft, and the way it has done ever since the gate came up. And if you stand at the bend by the red rock, you can still see, half sunk in the bank and gone soft with moss, the gray timber of a thing that was built to steal a valley and could not, in the end, outlast one girl who refused to believe the sky had done it. She had walked out of that house with $2.40 and a dead man's knife. She walked the rest of her life on ground that was hers, beside water that answered to her hand, and she never once said, "I told you so," because the creek said it for her every hour of every day, running clear and cold down a bed that the powerful had sworn would stay dead forever. If this story moved you, sit a moment with the people in your own life who were counted out and proved the counting wrong. And if you would walk another dry creek with me, there is another waiting, in another valley, with another thing buried at the end of it.